the 5th version, the Santa Cruz Bronson sees some subtle yet very important updates. As MX bikes have been around for a little bit longer, manufacturers and riders are learning what makes an MX bike good and how they're different than equal wheel size bikes. So Santa Cruz has applied some of that modern MX bike understanding to the Bronson V5 to make it probably one of the best mullet bikes to date. So stick around to see if it's the right bike for you. And yes, let's address this elephant in the room. I ran out of talent in a corner a couple days ago. I now have a collarbone that has way more pieces than a stock one. Bike was totally fine. I'll have surgery here in the next day or two and I will be back up to speed. In the meantime, I do have some reviews that I filmed pre-injury, so we'll still get to those, as well as some content that doesn't require riding a bike. If there's anything you want to see that obviously doesn't require riding a bike, just let me know and I'll do my best to make that video while I'm riding the Pine. So what's new about the Bronson V5? At first glance, you probably will notice some subtle changes with the frame design. Notably, the shock tunnel is a bit less of a tunnel these days. That design is much more open and it's likely for better access to the shock, could be some weight savings, but you know, that's a big practicality win in my book. With that, we see the shock getting even lower in the frame, not only changing the bike's kinematic, but helping keep the weight low and central. The travel amount stays the same as the previous version at 150/160, but it does feel quite a bit different. And we also see some changes in geo, namely the slacker head tube angle, the wheelbase gets longer, and maybe most importantly, the rear center grows quite a bit. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a second here. In a trend I'm maybe not necessarily the biggest fan of, the CC frame does not have cable routing for wired or cable drivetrains. It is for wireless only. There's routing for the rear brake and the dropper post, and that's it. The C-frame does have routing for cabled drivetrains. I guess there's an argument to be made for weight savings on the wireless only frame, but the versatility and practicality losses are a bit annoying in my book. So now let's go ride and take a deep dive on the Bronson 5. I do apologize. I was able to ride this bike quite a bit, but I was only able to film one full ride before I shattered my collarbone, so we don't have a ton of diversity in the riding footage here. So uphill, the Bronson V5 is very Santa Cruz to its core. It's a slightly relaxed and casual climber that excels when it comes to providing traction and technical climbing. We've got two major changes that impact how the Bronson climbs: the suspension kinematics and the geometry refinement. Starting with the suspension kinematics, the Bronson 5 has been made more active on the pedals than the previous version, meaning there's going to be a little bit less pedal platform or anti-squat, and subsequently a bit more pedal bob, but that's in favor of more traction and comfort and control. And of course there are benefits to that on the downhill, but we'll get to those in just a minute. Out on the trail you can feel that more active suspension platform, but I wouldn't say that the bike is necessarily inefficient or really way less efficient. It still pedals well enough for the category, and the traction improvements on those steep, loose, and techie climbs are noticeable, especially on an MX wheel bike with a smaller wheel. I'd take that added traction every day of the week because a smaller tire has a smaller contact patch, so you're gonna have a little bit less traction naturally. So to get more out of your suspension is pretty beneficial. The Bronson is a great technical climber and it's still efficient enough for big rides, but I wouldn't say it's the best climber in the category. Now we can jump into those geometry refinements. And the two biggest things you'll notice are the steeper seat tube angle and the longer rear center. Both of those things will keep your weight centered better between the wheels. Mullets can tend to have a pretty rearward weight bias, so by increasing the rear center and making that seat tube angle steeper, you can get that weight bias a little more neutral, especially in that seated position. And that comes across out on the trail in better traction and control over the bike because your weight is centered up better between the wheels. You're weighting them both equally and you're over them both equally, so you can control the bike better. And you won't always feel like you're falling off the back of the bike quite as much, especially on those steep climbs. The fit on the Bronson is very upright and comfortable. And I'm a tall guy and I tend to prefer a tall front end, and I'll typically run my stem at the top of my steerer tube and even run riser bars on top of that. But on this Bronson, I did have to lower my bars a spacer or two to keep enough weight over the front wheel. That upright feel is great on longer rides, especially for my old man back and neck. But riders who like a more racy and sporty feel might struggle to get that out of the Bronson. You might not be able to run your bars low enough. The stack height increased by 10 millimeters over the previous version, and it puts it at one of the tallest stack heights in the category. Overall, I'd describe the Bronson as a comfortable and competent climber, especially technically, and in loose, steep terrain. It's not the most efficient climber, but it is still good enough for the category. I'll still take it on big days. I have no complaints about that, but it does shine when things get technical and rough. Now, jumping into the fun part of the Bronson, and on a bike like the Bronson, this part is especially fun. Downhill on the Bronson is a pretty unique experience. The Bronson isn't made to be a race bike or the fastest bike to the bottom of the mountain. Instead, it's designed to be the most fun and playful. It is plenty capable, and the refinements Santa Cruz have made to the suspension and geometry make it one of the best Mullets I've ridden to date. As Mullets have been around longer, we're starting to learn the intricacies and subtleties that separate them from 29ers. They require different designs to optimize around different wheel sizes. And we've started to see a trend of longer chainstay lengths on Mullets to help with stability and traction while still offering the agility of a smaller wheel. Granted, a short chainstay would add to the agility factor, but at the expense of stability and traction. So instead, we're finding a sweet spot with a longer rear center and a smaller rear wheel with a smaller radius that leans over and corners more easily. Plus, there's the added benefit of butt clearance for shorter riders. That's not something I know much about, but I have heard some vertically challenged folks complain about it. So let's start with those suspension improvements. We see a more active design, allowing for better small bump sensitivity and less pedal feedback. With less anti-squat, there will be less influence from the chain through the pedals, giving you a better suspension feel through the bumps. Of course, one of the trade-offs is pedaling efficiency, but on a 150 mil bike, that's a trade-off I'd take every time. This improvement comes across in an ultra smooth and plush suspension feel that isn't overly gooey or too easy to blow through. There's still plenty of mid-stroke support, especially given how soft that initial stroke feels. And that gives the Bronson a plush yet fun and lively quality. It's great in small chatter as well as pumping and jumping and cornering. Talking about the geometry refinements on the Bronson, the biggest things you'll notice are the slacker head tube angle and longer chainstays and overall longer wheelbase, all of which equate to more stability and capability. The Bronson 5 is one of those bikes that you can take on any trail and never feel outgunned. Those longer chainstays are particularly important here to help keep the weight bias a little more neutral, something that Mullets have historically struggled with. Each size has its own chainstay length too, which should help riders of all heights have a good front to back balance on the Bronson. Even with those longer stays, I still noticed a bit of a rearward weight bias on this bike. And that came across as me getting pushed rearward or pushed off the back on big G-outs and compressions. So I had to make a very conscious effort to stay over the front of the bike. And I typically ride a bike pretty far over the front. And on this, I had to really work for that position to keep my weight centered where I wanted it in those big compressions. Lowering my handlebar height on the steerer tube helped quite a bit here. The Bronson's handling is my favorite part about the bike. With the smaller rear wheel, you have a smaller radius from the hub to the ground. And this allows that wheel to lean over more easily than a big wheel. It helps keep that rear end feeling lively and snappy around corners. The Bronson feels very easy to dive in and out of tight corners. One of the trails that I found the Bronson the best on was this steep rut track with a lot of high-speed S-curves and chicanes. And the Bronson made it extremely fun to kind of surf or just whip that back end around through that rut. Overall, the Bronson makes a great all-mountain bike that skews towards a lively and active riding style. It's plenty capable while being fun just about everywhere. It might not have the rolling speed and capability of a full 29er, but it more than makes up for it in fun points. So let's make a couple of comparisons here, and it makes a lot of sense to compare the Bronson to the 5010. I think that Santa Cruz has learned a lot about MX bikes with the new Bronson, and it shows. The front to back balance is better with a more neutral weight bias. Those longer stays go a long way in helping with better traction and stability by increasing the wheelbase and just putting you in a better spot between the wheels. The Bronson obviously is much more capable than the 5010 on the descents by more than it would just look like on paper. The 5010 obviously is lighter and quicker and snappier on the climbs, but it's still fairly versatile and capable of handling rough trails. I've been spending quite a bit of time riding 150 mil travel all mountain bikes this summer, and I'm convinced that's the best travel amount for anybody who wants a do-it-all bike. The Ripmo is one of those bikes I've spent a lot of time on lately, and while I haven't ridden the Ripmo in MX mode, and likely won't be able to for quite a while, I still think it's worth comparing these two. The Ripmo feels a little bit more balanced between uphill and downhill performance than the Bronson. I think it's slightly more efficient on the pedals, but maybe not quite as smooth in rough terrain. It's every bit as fun as the Bronson, but in a different way. The Bronson is very quick and zippy in the corners, while the Ritmo is very poppy and easy to get off the ground. Overall, I don't know if I can say one is more capable than the other. They both get the job done, just in different ways. So who is the Bronson for? Like I said earlier, the 150mm bike is the bike I think everybody should have. Unless you're racing Enduro or XC, I think this bike does everything and no one needs a bike other than that. The Bronson is easily one of those bikes that just does everything very well. It climbs well enough for big days, yet it rarely, if ever, feels outgunned in rough terrain. So it covers the whole spectrum of riding. That said, I think the Bronson does skew more towards a fun and active riding style. So the kind of rider who never gets off the ground or tiptoes through all the corners might not be getting the most out of it, because this bike really starts to shine as you get more creative with your line choice, as you get a little bit more aggressive in the corners, as you start to goof off and try to find little side hits. That's where the Bronson starts to shine. It facilitates goofing off and treating every trail like a playground. And while it facilitates a fun and playful riding style, I do think it's a great regular riding style bike for shorter riders. So if you're vertically challenged, but you're not necessarily the most playful or goofy or jumpy jibby rider, I still think this might be a really good option for you. Maybe even a better option than a full 29er, if only for the butt clearance. So that's gonna do it. I've been sitting up for too long, so I'm gonna go take a painkiller and take a nap in my lazy boy. See you next time.